When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Experience a membership that backs what you're building with American Express Business Platinum. Unlock over $3,500 in business and travel value annually with statement credits on select purchases from brands like Dell, Hilton, and Adobe, and other benefits. American Express Business Platinum. There's nothing like it. Based on total potential value of statement credits on select purchases and other benefits, enrollments required, monthly and other limits and terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum.
Could AI help you do more of what you love? Workday is the AI platform for HR and finance that actually knows your business. We help you handle the have-to-dos so you can focus on the can't-wait-to-dos. It's a new Workday.
Hello and welcome to How We're the Podcast. It's Martin here, and you're joining us today for part 2 of our Don Revie deep dive as we hope to answer the question, just how close did Don Revie come to managing Sunderland? And Kelvin, you're with me again this week. We covered a lot of the context, I guess, of Don Revie's Sunderland relationship and his playing career and what led to his departure at Roker Park. And such a fascinating time to pick through things and look at, and there's so many elements to this story, isn't there?
Oh, God, man. You start pulling at a string and talk about down the rabbit hole with it as well. There's so many bits to the story, so many things going on. It's really, really intriguing. You know, I know that we're not there yet, but Revie had that about him, didn't he? All his career seems to have been, you know, he didn't go quietly, did he?
No.
He just seems to have been a lad that has been able to generate this drama and intrigue for sure.
No, there's even more to pull at this week, I think, isn't there? And it's just, well, we've got Chris to help us pull at those threads. And Chris, you weren't able to join us last week, but did you enjoy listening to the episode of Revie's Sunderland career and the build up to this speculation that we're going to delve into and hopefully shed a little bit of light on today?
Oh, absolutely loved it, gents, as always. Just wish I was with you talking about it, but listening in, you know, you're kind of heading every ball as you two are talking about it. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, knowing the type of fella he is, and obviously we're going to come on to kind of what happened and everything, but knowing what happened with England and the type of fella he was, and actually if you look at photographs when he's in England, he always looks stern. He always looks like he's, I don't know, plotting his next plan or something like that. And you know, he's got that kind of Dick Dastardly kind of feel about him. And but as you guys were going through it, because you think about his move from Man City and the way all that happened, and you think he engineered that, you know, because he had a bust up at Man City, being played out of position and all that, and then he wasn't happy there. And then you think, did he engineer that move? And then he had a bust up with Alan Brown at Sunderland. And then you think, did he engineer a move away from Sunderland? And you're thinking all that as you two were going through it.
What you've got there, and one of the things that I think he was really, really good at, if you look at his transfer dealings and his negotiations in and around players, he had the art of brinkmanship down to he was a great brinkman, Don Revie, I think. So whatever he was stepping into, he's like 2 or 3 moves ahead in his head, you know. I think he had that brinkmanship about him that cannot be denied. I think everything that he was involved in, he's looking at the angles, weighing them all up and, you know, angling at something or other. I mean that in quite at the moment in quite a neutral kind of way, you know. I'm not
at the moment.
At the moment.
That's because you're Scottish, Kelvin.
Yeah. Well, I think he was married to a Scottish lady, wasn't he? He had his affinity with Scotland as well. He was married to a woman that he loved greatly. So the story goes.
Yeah, well, just on his move, because you obviously finished with his move away from Sunderland, going to Leeds. Well, actually, the thing that amazes me, because we spent just over 20 grand on him at the time, and it is weird looking at transfer fees at the time, because with everything going on in the game, let's say, with the old, as you mentioned, the Mr. Smith affair, and who knows what was going on at other clubs, there's this element of how much do you trust the reported transfer fees of those times and all of that. But if we spent around just over 20 grand, I think it was, and then at the time there was talk of, was he getting on a bit for the top flight? Was he still able to do it? Now, we have him for a couple of years. Leeds end up spending 15,000 to take him to Leeds when he wasn't getting. He played half the games at the start of that season in the second division. He played 9 out of 18 games, and we got 15 grand for him. And you're thinking, actually, if Leeds came in with that offer and took him to the top flight, suddenly, the leadership, and especially with having a bust up, because now you would think that would come into the negotiations, and Leeds would go, hang on, he's had a bust up, he's not happy there. We'll give you 5 grand and a bag of crisps or something like that, and you'll take it or leave it. But actually, on paper, it looks like we got a decent deal out of it, and he went back to the top flight, which it kind of doesn't make sense on paper.
Doesn't, but I think that's football at that time. There's so many different bits to it that you don't know. Maybe Leeds thought they had got a good deal at the time. They bought him from a second division club and a relegated club the season before to go and play in the top flight. So they obviously must have thought he still had enough about him to go and do a job there. And who knows, the stories that we covered last week about the reasons that Sunderland talked about in the press for signing him were all about his leadership and the long-term potential that Don Revie could have on the football club. And maybe Leeds saw that. Maybe Leeds saw that as more than an on-field signing, but somebody who could have a significant off-field influence as well. So there might have been that kind of came into it, but I suspect something that might have come into the fee was the fact that 15 grand that Leeds paid for him made him the most expensive footballer ever in English football. So his cumulative transfer fees took him over the next person. So there might have been something in that as well. If he might have said, well, let's call it 15 and I'll be quite happy with that. But we left the last episode, Chris, on promotion. So we got up in second place finally after 6 seasons of trying to get back to the first division after the first spell that we'd ever had outside the top flight. Leeds finished top under Don Revie's management, so both of us went up. And look, there's games in that season you could pick out and talk deeply about, and we might well do on another day. But everything looks rosy for Sunderland at the end of the season. We've finally got back to the first division. It's where we wanted to be. There's been all of this upheaval with, as we say, with the repercussions from the Mr. Smith thing. Alan Brown's led this team back up. He's got young players coming through, all this sort of stuff. He's done a great job. And then there's a bit of a bombshell.
Well, yeah, I mean, just talking about that time, and I've said before, actually, you look at it and the first ever relegation in the club's history, and when you look at it through the lens of the modern game, you look at when we went down and you look at the fight that he had to get us back, and you have to kind of bring in the context of the Mr. Smith and the whole Bank of England side and all that breaking up, and then the illegal payments and all of that. But you look at what happened in Division 2 and you look at the first couple of seasons when we went down and were finished in the lower reaches of Division 2.
Oh, he wouldn't survive today, would he?
Yeah, looking at it through the modern lens, it's nuts. But everyone, I think, knew what Alan Brown was like and what Alan Brown was building at the time. And just before we get in, obviously, the bombshell that you mentioned, talking about Don Revie starting his career out at Leeds in management. And again, Kelvin mentioned it earlier on. You always wonder whether he might have had one eye on what was going on, because he played under 2 managers. I think you might have mentioned in the last pod, or might have been 3 managers actually looking at it. Bill Lampton, Bob Roxburgh and Jack Taylor. And he might have been looking at what happened at Leeds, because Leeds ended up going down when he was a player, and he might have had one eye on potentially, with his age, what am I going to do next? What's my next move? And a lot of players then, there was the whole player manager thing, just stepping in. The oldest player, if they had some influence in the dressing room, he was the type of fella to have thought, actually, if I get myself into a position in this dressing room.
Oh, he's playing 3D chess, isn't he? Let's face it.
Yeah, we're going on about all this, and he probably had about 10 more moves in his mind than we could even imagine. I reckon he was probably manoeuvring himself into that position where he took over Leeds. And the thing is, you look at Leeds as well. I mean, Leeds were, like, terms of a tiny club, really. Rugby league was getting 5, 6, 7 times more in terms of crowds than the football team. And if you look at before Revie went there, the club had won out. I mean, Leeds United were a bit of a nothing football club before Revie went there. And the other thing as well, just bringing Alan Brown into the discussion, his bust up with Alan Brown, the way he managed, you do wonder if that had an influence on him, because Alan Brown, Brian Clough loved him. And it is interesting that Brian Clough loved him and Don Revie hated him.
Mm-hmm.
For someone who had
Yep.
massive influence, and those two clashed later on, and one was a fan of Brown and the other one wasn't. And you do wonder that disciplinarian that Clough ended up being. But Clough ended up being a hybrid, I think. I think Clough had that element of putting an arm around the shoulder, and whereas Alan Brown was just the disciplinarian, he was that school teacher type. But Don Revie seemed to go the other way, because all of the Leeds players, looked at him as this father figure. This fella who would put his arm around them and say, "You're brilliant, you're my man," and all of this sort of stuff. It is interesting, that influence that went in completely separate directions with Brian Clough and Don Revie based on playing for Alan Brown. You mentioned last time, during these few years, Don Revie's taken Leeds by the scruff of the neck. And actually just during that time, because he's bringing through players like Jack Charlton. And just on the Brian Clough thing, in Brian Clough's book, Walking on Water, it is quite interesting. He gives Don Revie, he doesn't do it very much, of course, but he gives Don Revie a hint of credit. He does say that, he's talking about Jack Charlton, and he said, if the academies and their coaches had been judges at the time, Jack Charlton would not have survived to become a World Cup winner with the boys of '66. He says Jack was a classic late developer at centre-half for Leeds and was never the greatest in the business, but Don Revie and Alf Ramsey saw enough to know he could be among the most effective. And I mean, for Brian Clough to actually give Revie some praise, it's good. But yeah, I mean, as all that's going on at Leeds, of course, you mentioned what's going on at Sunderland. Alan Brown eventually gets us up, and there's a bit of a hoo-ha, a bombshell or whatever in the summer when Alan Brown goes to all these lengths to get us back into Division 1. He's the man who drops us down for the first time. He goes through all these years of bringing these youth players through, changing the culture of the club, changing Sunderland again to go back into Division 1. And then in that summer, he's off. There's a difference of opinion about giving him a clubhouse, and you don't know really what the ins and outs were at the time. Kelvin, you might know a little bit more about whether this was the done thing, but you do wonder now that the club didn't just refused and just said, "You're not getting that clubhouse."
Yeah.
And Alan Brown says, "Right, well, if you're not doing that, I'm off." I did get the address at one point, and I was tempted to go and look at which house it was. And maybe it should end up with a blue plaque, Kelvin.
Absolutely. Get it a blue plaque. I think you'll need to take my colleague Andrew Smithson with you as well, because he's the sniffer in that regard, isn't he? He can sniff these places out. So you're right, though. There certainly was press report of this dispute between the board and Brown at the time of his departure. That's referenced in the press. I've not seen anything where the board acknowledge that, and certainly Alan Brown doesn't say anything about that. It seems to be coming, the stuff that I've looked at, it seems to be coming second and third hand that he made this request. And in answer to Chris's question there certainly was a history of the Sunderland board going back eons, decades, allowing players, bringing them into a clubhouse and then allowing them to buy that clubhouse. And I think it was a really good deal that they had for a long time, where the player bought the house at the price that it was when they moved into it.
Yeah, okay.
As well. There was quite a lucrative kind of deal. And I couldn't see any history of managers and what have you doing that, whether it just hadn't been reported. I couldn't find anything myself. But Charlie Hurley alludes to another element to this in his book, The Greatest Centre-Half the World's Ever Seen. He talks a little bit about Brown going. Obviously, he was a big Alan Brown fan, Charlie. You saw him for, his warts and all. You know, he didn't just hold with everything that he did. But one of the things he said was that all the lads were on good bonuses to win promotion. I suppose for those days we did really well out of it. Alan Brown told me he got nothing. He didn't get any bonus. He didn't get anything out of it. It's a very strange thing when you look at Brown's character and the qualities that he brought to the club when he got the job and that he displayed throughout his time as the manager. Was he would have no truck with underhand dealings, and he'd play everything straight and above board. And if money was your main motivator, you probably weren't my kind of player.
Yeah.
You know, that seems to come across with him. So for this to be the only reason why he goes, to me, it seems like, I wonder whether it's the tip of an iceberg, you know, whether there's other things, other issues, as well as the board not allowing him to buy his house. It's 3 weeks before the start of the new season. 6 years to get here, and a hell of a lot of pain for Brown, because he described himself as one of the most hated men in Sunderland at one point when things weren't going well in those early seasons. So it's another a moving part and intangible part of this story, isn't it? That's what happens and that he does go. Sid Collins, he gave an interview on the 14th of July. I think he is the new chairman, the chairman. He's trying to control the narrative a bit and does actually say that Alan Brown rang him at 11 o'clock on a Friday night to tell him that he wanted immediately released from his contract. And I think what he did was said, I haven't got the power to do that. We'll take it to a board meeting. And Brown was at that, called into that board meeting. They asked him, allegedly, to think again and not go, but he refused. He was adamant he was going. And Brown actually announced his departure. And one of the things, he kept repeating the same line. I saw this a few times. I've achieved what I set out to do. Now I must move off and find another challenge. And off he went to Chef Wed, who were embroiled in their own scandal, match fixing scandal.
Yeah.
They were
It was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, massive. So off he goes. Charlie Hurley, in his book, he says it's really, as you read his book, it's a great book to read, that great centre half the world's ever seen, because you can just hear Charlie Hurley speaking. You know, he just says the board didn't have a clue who they wanted, and we went into that season without a clue. And also Jimmy Munty got injured, and they only had 15-year-old Derek Forster was the only other goalkeeper on the club's books at that time. So what shambles.
When you look at it, even in terms of timing, so Alan Brown kind of goes out the door mid-July, towards the end of July. The season's going to start in August. You know, again, Sid Collins, who, for people who remember last week's episode, he was the chap who just bumped into Don Revie on the platform at Manchester. And just so happened to be on the same train as was taking Don Revie up to Durham. In some newspaper reports, Sid Collins is saying, I'm going to take charge of the team until we appoint a successor. It's got, maybe that's where Niall Quinn got his inspiration from a few years later. The Secretary George Crow's also given a bit of control over first team affairs. The trainer as well, his name escapes me at the moment, but he's involved. But nobody seems to be really taking charge. And again, I think when you read Charlie Hurley's book, Kelvin, and reading between the lines, I think Charlie Hurley took a lot of responsibility in the dressing room at this point.
He said he did, anyway. Yeah.
You know, we kick off the season without a manager. And as you say, Kelvin, Monty was injured at the start of the season. I do think there was a 20-year-old reserve keeper who everybody was really surprised got overlooked in favour of Derek Forster. He was 15 years old and he never played first team football before. And of course, he gets chucked into the opening game of the season against Leicester. And also Brian Clough's on the verge of a comeback. So Clough had been out for 18 months at this point.
Yeah.
Got back to full fitness. He played a few friendlies, and the whole rhetoric in the press was that Clough was back. He's back to full fitness. Brian Clough saying, my knee feels absolutely fine. I just need to get my fitness back up to compete. So Brian Clough's on the verge of a comeback as well. And you do wonder in hindsight, because obviously, as most people will know, he came back and played a few games. I think he scored against Leeds, if I'm not mistaken.
It was, yeah.
Which, again, it's a lovely little bit of symmetry in the world of football, isn't it? But then he retires. Well, that's right. Then he retires, and you wonder if we'd had a manager in place where that would have happened, because Clough's view on that was that the club cashed in his insurance.
Yeah.
He kind of felt he could have played on at a different level, perhaps, where he could have played on, but the club cashed him in, and that was that. And you do wonder, from that perspective, if we'd had an Alan Brown in charge at that point, what would have happened with Brian Clough. That's another sort of side story for another day. But the club don't seem to be in a massive hurry to appoint somebody. Now, if you put yourself in the position of a club chairman who has gone through a major scandal, the club's got relegated, took them 6 years to get back up, the manager who's got them back up eventually chucks it in for whatever reason a few weeks before the start of the season, you'd be scrambling to get a manager. Now, we've done that in the past and ended up with David Moyes, so you can maybe say that taking the time is probably a good thing, but they're going into September still trying to figure out who on earth's going to replace Alan Brown. Apparently, they've got a short list of 4 people, and kind of they're trying to get people to apply for the job rather than approach people. They obviously maybe don't want to pay compensation, maybe don't want to be caught doing the wrong thing, making an illegal approach or anything like that. There's rumours early September that Tommy Docherty, who was then the manager of Chelsea, I think he's only in his 30s, he was a young manager at the time, he'd had talks and decided to turn the offer down. Whether that's true or not, there's kind of disputed versions of events there from both sides, but he was strongly linked. And then there was a chap called Dave Bowen, who I must admit I'd never heard of until we started researching this. But this was a fella who was at Northampton. He was a Northampton town manager. And he sounds like the up-and-coming hot property in managerial terms at the time. He got Northampton up from Division 4 to Division 2 in successive seasons. And apparently he'd accepted the job. He'd been offered the job, had talks, accepted it, and then had a change of heart. And after accepting the job, he then made a phone call to Sid Collins saying, actually, I've changed my mind. But on the field, again, we've gone through this whole 6-year period of trying to get back up. Things aren't going too well. We drew against Leicester on the open day of the season. We lost away at West Brom, lost away at Tommy Docherty's Chelsea. We've drawn at home to West Brom, drawn at home to Leeds 3-3, and that was a game that Cloughie got his only goal. Drawn at home to Aston Villa, then lost games away at Arsenal and away at Aston Villa. So the desperation on the board side is going to be growing and growing because we just don't have anybody taking control of this situation. The club are desperate to get somebody in, but they're kind of desperate to get the right person in. And what their view of the right person is that, again, it's different times. They're not going to make it public who they're going after. There's not going to be the in-depth analysis that there is now to look back on. But they don't seem to be moving too quickly until mid-September, when it all seems to blow up over a couple of days. And we're going to take a very short break, and we'll come back to the 16th of September 1964, when rumours are abounding of who the new person in the Roker Park dugout is going to be. We'll be back after a couple of ads.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
When I found out I was going to be a parent, I immediately felt a lot of anxiety and worry. So I went on to BetterHelp to try to look for a therapist to help me with that.
My relationship with my family and with my boyfriend and with myself were suffering. I really needed help.
I was ruminating a lot. Really getting those thoughts out to a therapist and getting feedback was just life-changing.
Discover what BetterHelp Online Therapy can do for you. Visit BetterHelp.com today.
Sports Social Podcast Network, the biggest voices in sport. Let's take a look at some of the lineup. The Upshot.
The 1930 World Cup was absolutely mental. The refs wore suits and the Romanian team was selected by the king.
Football Social Daily.
The fact that he blatantly just ignored him when he came off the pitch was just horrendous man management.
Stretford Paddock.
For the midfield, this is like one of the most defining summers in probably like a decade.
All on Europe's biggest sport podcast network. Find your next favourite sport podcast. Search Sports Social Podcast Network and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Verified comparison at content.sport-social.co.uk/comparison.
Welcome back to How We're the Podcast, and we are well into this deep dive about the possibility of Don Revie taking control at Sunderland and trying to uncover just how much truth was in the rumour at the time. Now, Kelvin, Wednesday the 16th of September, 1964, and this is what used to happen, wasn't it? You get the paper in the morning to find out what was going on, the latest rumours, and the papers on this Wednesday morning had all sorts of stuff going on, didn't they?
Oh my goodness. The story and stories in the press about this, they must have had people's fans' heads spinning, man. So there were press reports of a 3-hour boardroom meeting. The club seems to have managed to do that without the press being aware of it. It seems to have they managed to convene without a leak.
Which is an improvement, isn't it? It's a step in the right direction.
Oh, yeah. Things are getting better. Things are getting better. Slowly, But the chairman emerged to confirm that there'd been a further application had been received and that the board were contacting the applicant to interview. Now, it probably seems appropriate at that stage that they don't say who that person is. But meanwhile, 100 miles south, Don Revie's confirming that he's applied for the job. It's just not joined up, really, is it? Don Revie's confirming that he's applied for the job. He didn't know when the board would meet to make a decision, and if he was successful, he would ask the Leeds board to release him immediately from his contract, even though that contract had a further 2 years to run. There was an interesting little side story to that. One things that Colin said was, there were two things that I found amazing there. So he said the board would be contacting the applicant to interview, and then he said, I'm off on a business holiday tomorrow morning. And he'd given his colleagues on the board full mandate to negotiate with the applicant. So I thought, there you go. That's trusting your colleagues. And then he added if it doesn't come off, we've got other applicants to consider. It just trying to follow the thread of that, really, The press rumours on those applicants, though, I don't even think this was in the same. I'm trying to remember what I looked at, but I don't think it was in the same paper even. But there was talk of, there were rumours of Stan Cullis, who had just not long been sacked from the Wolves post. And he was a highly regarded football man. And then one from left field was Chief Scout Charlie Ferguson, a man with a huge reputation inside the club at that time, a very highly regarded man. But in the club, it was all to do with the scouting system that he'd implemented alongside Alan Brown. He'd worked with Alan Brown for a long, long time. He worked with him at Burnley. And I think Ferguson had dipped his toe in the water with South Shields, I seem to recall, in terms of management. But so that seemed like an odd one to me, But as I say, whilst Sid Collins is playing all coy about who's going to be interviewed, 100 miles south, Don Revie's telling the press that he's applied for the job and that he wants if he gets it, he wants the board to release him from his contract.
It's baffling to me that after all of this has been going on, and this is September we're talking about now, middle of September, Alan Brown resigned, 2 months ago. We still haven't appointed the manager. And he's the chairman packing his bloody jocks and his swimming trunks to go to Monaco on business. Like, it beggars belief.
Yeah. Well, it's like the Prime Minister going on holiday when COVID was kicking in and all that sort of stuff, isn't it? It's on those sort of levels. I'm going to come into this conversation. I'm going to go back to our 3D chess, because my take on all of this is, as you said, it's in September. This comes 2 days after we're beaten by Aston Villa in the 8th game of the season, to leave us 19th in the table out of 22 teams at the time, by the way. We still haven't won. And in 8 games, we've conceded 22 goals. Now, this goes back to Martin's kind of, why isn't the board panicking and getting someone in to steady the ship, because on the face of things, we haven't won in the first 8 games and we're going down. And we've just come up with Leeds, and Don Revie's completely turned around Leeds United in those years and took them back up, won the title ahead of us. And if you look after 8 games, Leeds United are second in the table after 8 games.
Yeah.
They've won 5, drawn 1, lost 2. They're 2 points behind league leaders Chelsea. Back in the days of 2 points for a win. Now you go and look what's happening at Leeds. Now Leeds are in a position where Don Revie's asked for a 5-year contract, and they've given him a 3-year contract, and he's not happy about it. Now you go back to Brian Clough, because you can't talk about Don Revie without bringing Brian Clough every 2 minutes. But my theory about Brian Clough and his links to Sunderland were always about him getting a better contract at Nottingham Forest or Derby or wherever he was at that point. And I don't think at any point he had any intentions of really managing Sunderland. I think he was more comfortable managing those smaller clubs where he could go in and have complete control, and, you know, the Nottingham Forests and the Derbys of the world. And I think the Leeds experience burnt him as well on that. I always thought that Brian Clough didn't really want to cloud his time at Sunderland because he loved it so much. I just think in this day and age, this is Don Revie getting his 5-year contract, and it's almost sticking 2 fingers up and saying, you know, the board better give me this 5-year contract or else I'm off.
Well, there's every chance of that, but what you've also got to consider as well is the reputations of both clubs at the time. So Sunderland had only ever been in top flight until we got relegated and had those 6 seasons out, and we'd gone back up. So in terms of a giant of English football, it's not like looking at Leeds and Sunderland now, is it? It's like a giant of English football was back into the top flight. We'd won league titles, we'd won the FA Cup, we had the reputation of the team of all the talents and all that sort of stuff. Whereas Leeds were coming up on the tracks, they were a newcomer into that upper echelons of football. So in terms of a reputation, you're talking about completely different levels of football clubs at this point of history.
That's true, but we're talking about Don Revie here, and I don't think that came into it. I think it was, and it's a day and age when the difference, now you're talking about the difference between an Arsenal or a Man City at the top of the Premier League and I don't know who's just gone up, who's just won the title, I don't know, Southampton or something like that coming up. The money difference there is huge. I think at this point, it was just about whoever offered Don Revie more money and for longer.
That
and
may be the case.
That's what it came down to.
Well, what we're trying to do is figure out just how close he came. So whether he was playing 3D chess or not, it may not have worked out the way he wanted to, or it may have worked out the way he wanted to.
Just to chuck in another move he had, he did this while the Leeds chairman was in hospital after a car accident.
Yeah.
Well, I think to be fair to Mr. Revie, that was a little bit of a coincidence. But
you reckon?
I reckon so, because
he'd had weeks to apply for this job, remember? He only did it in September. The job had been there since July.
What you've got to remember is I had to post the letter, Chris, and however you like to think of it, Royal Mail is not that fast.
Ooh, harsh.
But in the Yorkshire Post that day as well, big headline on the front page, Revie for ROKER bombshell at Elland Road. He applies for the post after the board refused to extend his contract. And, it's saying Elland Road was as sad a soccer ground as I have ever known today. On the front page of the Evening Chronicle, by the time it gets to the evening of this day, the Leeds chairman from his hospital bed, he's issuing stay away things, saying, we are not having this. Don Revie is not going anywhere, blah, blah, blah. Something that we're going to be wasting the time. But Revie has applied for the job. And it's a really interesting thing when you dig into it, because the chairman says Revie has asked the club for a 5-year contract, was only given one for 3 years. I fought to get his contract extended to 5 years. The other directors on the board are behind me, but we are not strong enough to carry it through, which I thought is a really interesting thing for a chairman to admit to. But he says his present contract is binding in both ways. He has signed a contract for 3 years and he will run for the 3 years. That's definite. He's saying he's not going to be released from it. At the same time, you've got one chairman in hospital. Sid Collins is in Mallorca. And Vice Chairman Laurie Evans has said this is a matter that would be handled in a proper and orthodox manner, and we shall certainly speak to the Leeds club about it before any decision's made. And he said applications are coming in all the time, just give him a little bit of a get out. But what's clear, we can dispute the motivation behind it, and dispute what's going on in people's minds. What is clear at this point is Revie has wanted a longer contract at Leeds. He hasn't got it, and he has applied for the vacant Sunderland manager's position. And, you talk about the timing of it. What's really interesting is the day or two before, the Sunderland chairman, Sid Collins, had said in the press he wanted anybody interested to apply in writing now, right? So whether that's being lined up with something else, or it's completely coincidental, or it's been the driving factor in Revie getting his envelope and his writing pad out of his desk and writing his note and licking the envelope and plonking the stamp on. The facts are that Revie wanted a new contract at Leeds. The board weren't going to give him it, so he did apply for the Sunderland job, and Sunderland wanted to talk to him about the job.
Just quickly on that, I just wanted to mention, because you talked about the vice chairman's comment, I just wanted to actually read Sid Collins' comment about buggering off to Mallorca. He said before he left to Mallorca, apparently there was a 3-hour board meeting, and his comment was, "I have given the board a full mandate to negotiate in my absence, and I have complete confidence in their ability to see the job through successfully." So he basically just went, "I'm buggering off on holiday," and it's down to them. The other thing I wanted to mention is, you do wonder, this written application by Don Revie, how long do you think this existed in the club's archives?
Hey, it might still be there.
You wonder if it sat around in someone's desk, or after it all washed over, maybe someone just ripped it up and went, well, that's done with, and put it in the bin or something like that.
We won't need that anymore.
Or whether it stayed in a set of drawers somewhere for 20 years or something like that, and nobody pulled it out, because that would have been interesting. But like you said, it is interesting on what you talked about there, Martin, about that comment by Sid Collins about somebody putting it in writing. Because the bizarre thing is, now we are 2 months down the line now. So the first question is, what's been going on up to that point? What's been going on in those first 2 months?
Have they been looking at holiday brochures from Mallorca?
He's been counting his pennies in the boardroom, and then to pay in bags of copper and stuff. Yeah, so what's been going on for 2 months? Have they been going out speaking to people? Have they been talking about people? Applications are coming in all of the time. So what have they been doing for 2 months? That's a question. But that is an interesting thing, where you do wonder whether, having known each other from previous days, whether Sid Collins and Don Revie have had conversations.
They might have met on the platform of the station, completely coincidentally.
Like, get the same train to work, It's funny, when you were talking about it in the first pod, I was thinking about the old Ashley Cole and Steven Gerrard and Jose Mourinho and all of that sort of stuff, and the hoo-ha about that. But back in the 50s and the 60s, it was, we just bumped into each other and we were going on the same holiday. But you do wonder if those conversations have been going on, and Sid Collins had said, what you're going to have to do is officially apply, and then we'll take it from there and see what happens after that. And maybe at that point, but this is the thing, if Sunderland really wanted their man, then with that contract, Sunderland are going to have to pay money, aren't they? Because Leeds won't just release.
Leeds have to agree to release him to start with, so there'll be a fee and all that sort of stuff to pay for Leeds. But the relation, this is why it's interesting when you kind of put the pieces together, because Revie's relationship and timeline with Sid Collins suggests to me that it would be surprising, after all of that had gone on previously, for Revie to then use Collins to get more money elsewhere. There were a number of jobs he could apply for and achieve the same effect with people who he's never worked with before or wasn't friendly with. So that kind of doesn't kind of sit with me.
But it makes it more believable, though, doesn't it?
Well, perhaps, but you're then going to completely piss off somebody who you've had a good relationship with. Why would you do that if there was another way of doing it and achieving the same effect? The other thing that's interesting in all of this, and I think, Chris, you touched upon it earlier in terms of the methods that Don Revie took from Alan Brown, what Brian Clough took from Alan Brown, because the newspaper reports on this day talking about Revie and how he manages. It says, at this point of his managerial career, and bear in mind he'd been, 3-4 years into being a manager, it says his managerial methods have followed Alan Brown's pattern very closely during the last 3 years. Like Mr. Brown, he has developed a strong youth policy, enforced rigid discipline at all levels of Elland Road. So he obviously evolved and changed as a manager over time, but at this point he'd gone in and been a disciplinarian and really got them organised. But the news of Revie's seemingly impending appointment at ROKER Park had gone down really well with supporters. So there's a number of quotes in the paper, Chris, and all these fans who have been interviewed for this newspaper article are really excited. They might be excited about anybody coming at this stage of the season for eight games gone and no manager, but they think this is a coup, a brilliant deal for the club.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, after that, we talked about the job he's doing at Leeds. And like I said, they're second in the table. So they've come up and they've taken to life in Division 1 like a duck to water, and we're struggling at the bottom. This is our big return to Division 1. And you were talking earlier, Martin, about our status in the game is still almost a giant in English football that should have never have gone down to the second division and did. And they've had this battle to get back up. We're back up in Division 1. And the club are in crisis 8 games in. I mean, it sounds familiar because since then, that's pretty much been the pattern, hasn't it? For whatever it is, 50 years since then, 60 years. But so the fans are desperate, but it ticks all the boxes, doesn't it? It ticks the ex-player, so we know him, and he didn't do fantastically well, but, you know, he came and he was an ex-player, so people know him. He's from the Northeast, so that ticks another box. That
North
people go,
Yorkshire.
yeah, well, yeah, okay. He's from the north. He's from north of Watford Gap, so that ticks a box.
And east of Manchester, that's all right.
Yeah. And he's doing a fantastic job with Leeds. But the other thing with that Leeds team, I mean, the letters that you're saying are comparing them to Alan Brown, that is interesting because I think they ended up having the same result at their club, but by doing it in very different styles. So, you know, I think Don Revie had complete discipline over his side by everybody respecting him and being that father figure and didn't want to disappoint him. Whereas Alan Brown was that teacher you didn't want to disappoint. So I think they did it in very different ways, but they had the same impact on their players. You know, as soon as he went in there, I mean, they started to get this reputation as dirty Leeds when they were on the rise, when they won that second division title ahead of us. And then early in the first season that we're talking about, when they were second in the league after 8 games, but, you know, during this season, there's a big incident at Goodison Park when the Leeds players descended into a brawl against Everton. Now, that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, under an Alan Brown team. I don't think Alan Brown would have, from what I've read, obviously not seeing his teams, but from what I've read and what Brian Clough said about him and everything I've heard, I don't think Alan Brown would have allowed his team. And I don't think teams would have known that they can't get involved in that because Alan Brown, you know, won't let them or doesn't want them to be like that. But Don Revie's side were like that. But for Sunderland fans looking in from the outside of that Leeds side, they're going to go, God, they're tough. God, they battle for every ball. You know, from when they read reports and Leeds players are fighting other players, there's going to be an element of Sunderland fans going, fancy a bit of that. Fancy a bit of that. So, yeah. Especially, you know, when the side haven't won and we're 8 games in. We're 8 games in. We've conceded 22 goals in 8 games, and the fans are going, we need a bit of steel here. We need the players to kick up the arse. And Don Revie just ticks all the boxes, doesn't he?
Well, he does. And, you know, the general consensus from the supporters I interviewed are that, you know, he'll make a good manager because he's tough. What he's done for Leeds, he can do for Sunderland. This is really good. Revie will be just right. A chap from Bolden, Byron Avenue from Bolden Colliery, says he's a good manager. I think he gets a team to work like a team, and he's a man the players will respect. An interesting one. It's quoted in the newspaper story. John Tennick, a Dundas Street confectioner who organises coach parties and rail excursions for away matches. And of course, that's a name that everybody will be familiar with. Said that if Revie was appointed, he had no doubts he'd be the saviour of Sunderland. He has the guts, power, and providing he gets the reins, he'll pull them out of the doldrums. I remember him as a good player at Sunderland, and I know he'll make a good manager if he returns. So that's the general consensus on this Wednesday afternoon, early evening. The fly in the ointment, potentially, Kelvin, is that Leeds are playing Blackpool that night. Don Revie's still officially manager of Leeds, and he takes charge of the game at Elland Road, and they win 3-0. Revie actually tells the players he's off.
Yeah, and I don't think, from what I've read, that he does that after the game. I think he does that before the game. Because Billy Bremner, I can't remember it word for word, but I'm sure he says that he gathered the team around after they'd been told, and that he would, that they wanted to go out. If this was to be Don's last game as their manager, they wanted to go out with a really good win. And
no, that's right.
That's what they put on for him. So that's, to me, that says we've got a guy here that's made his mind up, and that he's coming to Sunderland, and he's told these lads, these boys, that he had a father-like relationship with. I was going to say, when we're talking about Revie being influenced by Brown, I think Alan Brown was always a manager that was respected by some, but very few people said that they liked him, whereas Don Revie, his lads, his team liked him most of them liked him so he was likable in that regard. If you were on the inside, he could be a very, very likable character and had that to his nature.
No, that's right.
I think we've got a bloke here, given his relationship with those players, I think we've got a bloke here that's made his mind up that that's what's happening, and he's going, and he'll control how that happens. He'll tell the players he's going. I'm struggling with the idea that he was still, engaged in brinkmanship at that point. I'm struggling with that. I'd credit or discredit him with a lot of things, but I'm struggling to think, given his relationship with them lads, that he would have told them he was going when he wasn't. I'm having a difficulty with that.
Well, no, I do too, because the devil's advocate in you goes, well, he wouldn't have needed to say anything to the players.
No,
but there was rumours in the press, so I guess he would have to address them to some extent. But there's a couple of quotes that are really relevant to this night. So Kelvin's touched upon one from Billy Bremner, which I'll come to shortly. But Don Revie said, "I had landed the Sunderland job. I was walking into the locker room at Leeds to collect my kit, and I came face to face with a group of newly signed apprentices. Believe it or not, they had tears in their eyes when I told them I was leaving." And in Billy Bremner's autobiography, I believe the quotes from Bremner come from, it said it was really very difficult to come to terms with that. It meant a return to his roots for Revie, but to the rest of us, it meant that he was leaving us and joining our rivals. Perhaps most people might have thought that we looked upon him as a traitor, but we didn't at all. He had made us, and even if he did leave, we could never thank him enough for what he'd done for us as individuals and as a team. We were determined that we should win his farewell game and win it well as a gift to show him what he had created. So this is a really elaborate game of 3D chess. If in the dressing room before the game, Revie's telling everybody I'm off. Because if he wasn't, he'd be going, oh, look, hopefully things will get sorted out with the Leeds board. Hopefully they'll give us a contract. Hopefully I'll be staying. It'll all be good. There's no need for him in that day where things aren't going to get out of the dressing room at such a pace that's going to affect things and all that sort of stuff. And I just think there's things here with as you hit on, Kelvin, the relationship he had with the players and also the relationship he had with Sid Collins. I don't think he's going to use them in the way he did. Who knows? But who knows? The thing is, Chris, after this match, all of a sudden the board decide to meet at Leeds, and that's that, isn't it?
What a surprise. I mean, you two are soft as clots, honestly.
No.
I think this is Don Revie playing the game. The job's there at Sunderland. He's clearly had conversations with Sid Collins, and the job's his. And he's kind of talked and said he'd expect a 5-year contract. Sunderland have went, well, of course, as long as we can get you out of Leeds United. And then what's that going to cost Sunderland? But it would have come down to that. Now, there's still a question mark over that. So, I think he's playing the long game. I think he's telling the players that he's leaving because he's then putting it on the players and saying, well, it's not my fault, it's the club's fault. I would love to stay with you. You're my lads, blah, 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 blah. But I've got no other choice because they're pushing me out. And the players are like, oh, no, we're losing him and it's not his fault. He doesn't want to go. And they become even more bonded to him because of that. And
you're filling in the lines with your own colour in here, Chris.
No, absolutely. I'm saying what I think's happened. I mean, but this is the type of fella Don Revie was. He wasn't this emotional kind of, he wasn't this, oh, well, I'm pulling on, these apprentices are pulling on the heartstrings and the players and all this sort of stuff. He only agreed to stay at Leeds when they offered him the 5-year contract, and then he signed the 5-year contract. So it was all down to what he wanted, and it was all down to the financial package. Sunderland were going to offer him that, and Sunderland were going to offer him a fantastic deal. If Leeds didn't match that or give him what he wanted, he would come to he'd have come to Sunderland.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at that point, so this is Thursday, the 17th of September. The game was the night before. At that point, the contract wouldn't have been on the table. So he's leaving. And don't forget, this is a motivation game, because you look at Billy Bremner, and you might come on to this, Martin, I'm sorry, but at the end of one of his quotes, he said, "We were determined that we should win his farewell game and win it well as a gift to him to show him what he had created." Leeds go out and win 3-0. Now, this is a 3-0 win against Blackpool in Division 1. And I'm just going to have a quick look actually at that point. Blackpool were 5th in the table. So they were no mugs. They went and beat Blackpool 3-0. The Leeds board at this point go, "Oh, bugger, we are, flying at the top of Division 1. Leeds had never really been in this position before in their history. Our manager, who's got us here, is threatening to leave. We've got no choice but to offer him what he wants." And as soon as that contract was put on the table, he signed it.
And I think this is the interesting thing, isn't it, though? Because what we are trying to figure out here is how close did Revie get to becoming Sunderland manager, right? And we've seen this play out countless times in football, haven't we? Where a player will do this thing, or a manager will do this thing, where they go, "I'm going to be off unless you give us this." Rarely it works. One of the only times it has worked is Lamine Kone, and we regretted that for years and years and years. This is so close to happening, right? And what I would also say as well, Chris, right, just to challenge you on something, I think when you watch that famous interview between Brian Clough and Don Revie, you can see which of those two is calculated and is ruthless in how they approach things. And you can see which one is more emotional and heartfelt. And you can say what you want about Revie in terms of how he went about things and what subsequently came out in the Revie files and all that sort of stuff. We know all of that stuff. We know he had a shady side to him. But I actually think he was a very emotional person. I don't think that kind of sentiment about it being a real pull for him to go away from Leeds. I don't think it was all a calculated manoeuvre thing to do all this, that, and the other. I think it was, a lot of it was heartfelt.
Well, look, I don't think it was as clear cut, but I do think at the end, I think the fact that he signs the contract proves what he was after. Because if the contract wasn't there, and he says, and because after that game, there was a meeting of the Leeds board that went on till midnight on the same night as the game. So on that Wednesday night. So that's how it went. And he says if Leeds had agreed to let him go before the game, he would have been a Sunderland manager. And I don't think it would have been easy for him. That's what I'll agree with you on. I don't think it was an easy decision for him. But at the end of the day, it was about one thing. It wasn't about the pull of Sunderland, because if Leeds had slapped a contract on the table, he would have went, "Well, actually, Sunderland have offered me a fantastic contract, so I'm going to Sunderland."
But the thing that you've got to consider in this, and this is where it's a little bit different to nowadays, is his contract had another 18 months to run, and Leeds were not going to let him out of that contract. If Leeds said you're not getting out of it, he didn't have an option to get out of it, right?
But again, this is the things he knew. He knew that. He knew that was the case. So he knew that.
Well,
that
yes and no.
even if he'd agreed everything with Sunderland, or he'd said he was off, he still says, if Leeds had agreed to let me go. Or the other thing, and which I think was part of this, I don't think Sunderland, because they're talking about all the applications and the time this has gone on, I just don't think Sunderland would have paid the money to release him, to try and get him out of that contract and said to Leeds, "How much do you want?"
I think at this point they would have, because they're getting desperate and they haven't won the 8 games to start the season off. But I think what we've discovered going through all of this process and the relationships and press cuttings is, but for Leeds United going, "All right, we'll give you what you want," which wasn't a guarantee, by the way, in any way, shape or form. He could very easily have ended up at Sunderland. That's a point in time where if Leeds hadn't agreed to what he'd been demanding, Kelvin, he ends up at Sunderland in charge. And you look at what subsequently happened, and there's so many bits then, which obviously are all theoretical, but Brian Clough's still a player. If Revie comes in as manager, how does that affect Brian Clough? How does it affect the success that Leeds had for the next however long?
Yeah.
How does it affect what would have happened at Sunderland over the next however long? It's kind of fascinating at that point to go, well, if that had happened, if the Leeds chairman had gone, nah, actually, bugger off, we're not giving you what you want.
That's what I was about to say, that coming back to the question that we asked ourselves right at the start of all this, how close was he to coming? I think it was bloody close, is my reading of it. And I think the Leeds board met after that game that night, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right after that game. And I think but if that result had been 2-0 to Blackpool.
Are they inclined to give them that extra money in the extra couple of years?
Do they look at that and go, we'll get somebody else to manage? I feel like it's a right almost sliding door moment. I think he was close to coming. I think he'd told his lads. I'm still struggling with. I take Chris's point that he was calculating, that he was, he did play 3D chess. I take all of that, but he still has these, what I mentioned in the previous pod about these almost apparitions that he had, where you think, what the hell is he playing up there? Why is he doing that? And these sort of moments. And I think that's where his emotions get the better of his calculated side. I think he was pretty close to coming. And as you say, and when you think about what might then have happened, we would never have had that marvelous interview with him and Brian Clough. What a marvelous piece of television that was.
Superb, isn't it? It could have been the best of friends, couldn't it? It could have been each other's best men and all sorts, man.
Yeah.
I was about to say, that in a different reality somewhere, in a parallel universe, Don Revie comes in, Brian Clough joins his coaching staff, and they become legendary management team.
Yeah.
with Revie as number one and Clough as number two. But look, talking about, going back to that point about how close he was, and Kelvin said it there, that if the Leeds United board had been stronger, if they'd said, we've got a 3-year contract on the table, we're not going to be bullied by somebody, the club's bigger than that.
Yeah.
Don Revie would have been Sunderland manager the next day, probably.
Yeah.
Yep.
So in answer to the question that we posed ourselves at the start of the show, how close did Don Revie actually get to being Sunderland manager? As Kelvin said, bloody close. And we can argue about the motivation of it, we can argue about everything else, but bloody close is the conclusion that we've come to.
There's another scenario where both clubs call Revie's bluff and he's out of a job.
We were in the position to call anybody's bluff, and the chairman was in Mallorca sunning himself, so there you go.
I was just going to throw something into the mix there, and you talk about all these moving parts. We've got the World Cup coming in 1966. I would love to know what the timeline was on ROKER Park being one of the venues and Sid Collins being a major player in all of that.
It's actually really interesting you talk about that, actually, because it's something that cropped up in the research I did. During this 8-game streak of results that we haven't picked up a victory, and the chairman at the start of the season, after Alan Brown departed, it basically said, I'm in charge of team affairs until we appoint a successor. There's at least once, if not twice, where it's noted in the match report, Sid Collins wasn't present at the game because he was on scouting duty for England because he'd been appointed an England selector. So you've got this bit going on as well. So you're quite right in terms of the development of ROKER Park, getting the money for that, getting awarded the hosting rights for the World Cup. And for him to be on one side of the Mr. Smith stuff prior to that, having such an influence with Revie, taking up such a prominent position after everything happened, and having such a prominent position with the FA as well. He's wielding some power. And again, I don't think you can overlook that influence and power on this bit, because the Leeds board are dealing with somebody who is one of the FA's men to a large extent at this point. And, again, that dynamic's fascinating as well. But Yeah, there's a few occasions where he's not at the game as his newly promoted club are struggling to get results on board without a manager because he's scouting players for the next England international, which again, different times, but you find quite astounding, really.
You know, he's got bigger fish to fry, it feels like, Sid Collins, but
just on that point you just made there, Kelvin, it is interesting that Don Revie's reaction, because Martin was saying earlier that, he was kind of understanding of the position Sunderland were in, because his reaction to him signing a 5-year contract with Leeds and then the speculation with Sunderland ending was talking about speaking to the vice chairman, Laurie Evans. So this is only a couple of days after Collins has buggered off to Mallorca and he's on his sunbed. And in the days of that communication, when did he actually find out what actually went on? Did he not find out until he got back and everything? But Revie's reaction is to say, I am sorry to have caused Mr. Evans so much trouble.
Yeah.
But Leeds were adamant about my staying with them, talking about it being a long, drawn-out process and saying good luck to Sunderland, essentially. But it's interesting, you're talking about that, how much is Collins involved? What's he up to? Don Revie apologises to Laurie Evans, the vice chairman, rather than Sid Collins.
Again, you wonder if that's an easier thing for Revie to make a call on and call the club and say, I'm not going to accept the job, sorry. That's a far easier call to make somebody who you don't have a relationship with.
If he's so pally with Sid Collins and has that relationship over the years, he would have called him out by name and said, I'm sorry to Sid, sorry, I'm going to ring him up and apologise or whatever. But he said, I am sorry to have caused Mr. Evans so much trouble.
Well, but he was a person who'd been dealing with that day because Collins had buggered off. And again,
but surely you would have mentioned Collins if they had that relationship. You would have thought.
Maybe that was part of the reason that came into Revie's thinking, because you think, well, if he's the person I thought he was, he delays jaunt over to Mallorca by 24 hours to get this over the line. If he wants me that much, he's not going to leave the country.
That would fit with that is one of the things. It sounds so petty, doesn't it? But in terms of Revie and everything I've read about him, that would fit with my understanding of him, that if somebody slighted him in that way, that he would take umbrage. I'm not saying it was the only reason, but I think, I'm telling you, I think that would be a little factor for him that, the head gaffer, the big wheel didn't come and try and...
If you think if you were going to go for a job, right, and the boss doesn't turn up for your second interview because he said he was going to be here, but he's popped out to go to the shop. You think, well, you don't bloody want us, and
well,
I'd
you've
be
hit on
with Revie
something
on
there.
that. I'd tell him piss off.
Well, exactly. And you imagine if, and again, we're going to bring him into the conversation. You imagine if Brian Clough went to a club for an interview, or he'd applied for his job, but he was about to go, and somebody said, the manager's just gone to Mallorca.
Yeah.
Brian Clough would have said, bug you then, sod you. You can stick your job up your arse. And you do wonder how, and especially, there's just something in there to call Mr. Evans out by name and not Sid Collins when the
No, you're right.
I just think there's something in that.
Anyway, yes, Don Revie said if they'd agreed to let me go yesterday morning, I would have been at ROKER Park right away, but now it is all over. I hope Sunderland can soon pick up and start winning their matches, and that they get a good manager. The public up there certainly deserve it. So we've got to as conclusive an answer as I think we can without having insight into Mr. Revie's brain, and he can tell us what actually happened. So without that, Kelvin has got a direct line to...
No, I'm just thinking I'm glad we've cleared all that up, and I'm looking forward to getting into Mr. Smith and being as... and clearing all that up as well.
I'm not sure we'll get to such a conclusion with Mr. Smith, but similar to this story, there's so many moving parts, so many protagonists, and we'll never know for certain the answer, will we? But like this, you can kind of look in between the lines, draw conclusions from stuff, and see the dynamics going on, see the relationships going on, and you can get to a point where you go, actually, potentially this was the situation. Potentially Don Revie did come exceptionally close, bar one person's decision, and we don't know how the Leeds board worked. If it was a vote, it might have been a really close vote to give him a new deal. Like, we don't know that side of it, but I think the conclusion that we've reached here is that bar a single decision, he would have been Sunderland manager in September 1964, and who knows what that story, or what direction that story of Sunderland AFC goes on from there.
Yeah, and if he did turn us down, I think we might have missed a trick years down the line with Brian Clough, because I think all we had to say to Brian Clough was, Don Revie turned this job down. And I think Brian Clough would have probably jumped at it just because of that. Just that one, say that one thing to him, and then we would have had Brian Clough in the bag. He would have been our manager.
Well, there we go. I think we've covered as much ground as we possibly can with this. We've dug through the archives, got the story from what happened over those few weeks in 1964 and the years that preceded it, and it all weaves that story. And it's important to kind of do that first bit in part one that we did, Kelvin, with that playing career that he had, because it does give an additional context to what happened subsequently. But it's fascinating, isn't it, when you can kind of pick through the archives and try to figure out, basically, because I actually didn't know any of this managerial stuff until relatively recently. It's been something that I might have read a line about here and there, but I'd never really dug into it too much. And once you start digging into it, there is something of real substance there.
I'll tell you what's ironic is, if you remember when we're talking about the board and Bill Murray going to Blackpool for the two veteran players.
Yes.
You know that Ernie Taylor, a couple of years
ended up
later, comes
58, wasn't it?
And of course, if you look who disappears shortly after that, it is ironic, these strings that you pull at. And
it is.
Yeah.
Excellent.
What a good story. What a good
story. So thank you very much, Kelvin. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that.
And thank you very much, Chris.
Yep, absolutely brilliant. But I still think you're soft as clarts, gents.
No.
Go and get on with your 3D chess, man. Go on.
We will, of course, let the listeners make up their own minds on whether there's a real possibility or not. But I think Chris has certainly outvoted 2-1 if he's not coming over to our side. So there we go. Of course, we'll be back tomorrow on How We're the Podcast with another episode of the show. And we'll be back next week digging deep into something else to do with Sunderland AFC history. I'm not quite sure what we've got lined up for next week, but we will be back in your ears looking at something that may or may not have happened in the either not too distant future or very distant future. And hopefully Andrew will be back with us next week to elaborate on some bits and pieces as well. But until then, it's goodbye from us.